There's a strange thing that happens when a character refuses to disappear. Not fade away, not get rebooted cleanly, not even die with dignity, but they linger. They get reintroduced, reinterpreted, redesigned. They show up in different art styles, different tones, different rule sets, sometimes even different philosophies, yet we're still asked to call them by the same name. For Megaman, that lingering was not an accident. It wasn't nostalgia. I used to think it was. And it definitely wasn't indecision. It was strategy. In the last video, I talked about Capcom's lethal rebranding, not as a series of mistakes, but as a survival mechanism. A company repeatedly splitting one of its most recognizable icons into multiple forms, each one built to endure a different era of gaming. That wasn't Capcom losing control of Mega Man, that was Capcom refusing to let him become obsolete. But there's a difference between doing something and admitting you're doing it. For decades, Capcom maintained the illusion that there was still a definitive Mega Man, a core version, a true lineage. Everything else was framed as a spin, an experiment, or temporary detour, a side road you were allowed to enjoy but not take too seriously. That illusion cannot last forever, because eventually the audience grows up, the market fractures, technology accelerates, and the question stops being which Mega Man is your favorite. The question becomes, which one is supposed to matter right now? And that's where things start to break apart. When a franchise survives long enough, it really accumulates contradictions. Tones clash with tone, mechanics clash with expectations. I mean, Silent Hill's a perfect example of that. Fans argue not because they disagree, but because they're defending different versions of the truth that all happen to wear the same helmet. And Mega Man has more of those truths than almost any character in gaming. Bright and brutal, simple and systems heavy, timeless and aggressively dated. A children's icon and a narrative about endless war. Capcom spent years trying to pretend those things could all collapse back into one shape. They couldn't. So instead of choosing, Capcom did something far more dangerous. They stopped pretending there was only one answer. Dual override isn't important because of what it adds to Mega Man. It's important because of what it finally says out loud. It says that Mega Man is no longer a single identity being protected from delusion. He's a framework, a pattern, a set of ideas that can coexist without needing to cancel each other out. Two interpretations, two modes of play, two philosophies running in parallel, neither one declared definitive, and neither one treated as disposable. Make no mistake, this is more than just confusion now. This is an absolute confession. This is the moment Capcom stops asking which Mega Man should survive, and starts designing a future where all of them already have. And once you try to look at it through this lens, every reboot, every cancellation, every failed reinvention stops looking like a stumble, and starts looking like a branch that was never meant to be cut down. So today, this is not about announcing a new Mega Man. Not by a long shot. This is about understanding the moment Capcom admitted the truth. There was never going to be just one. Alright, so before dual override even existed as a concept, Capcom had already built the conditions that made it unavoidable. Not through single decisions or anything like that, but through decades of quiet course corrections that were never framed as such. On the surface, Mega Man looked like a franchise experimenting with tone and mechanics, but underneath that surface, something far more deliberate was happening. Capcom wasn't choosing new directions, they were preparing exits. Every major Mega Man branch was introduced during a moment of uncertainty, either technological, demographic, or economic, and crucially, none of them were positioned as replacements. Every new incarnation arrived carrying an unspoken contingency. If this works, it sustains the brand here. If it doesn't, the others remain intact. Classic Mega Man existed as a controlled variable. It was dependable, readable, and mechanically honest. Its rules were transparent, its difficulty was fair but demanding. It could be sold to children without explanation and to adults without embarrassment. More importantly, it was merchandisable in a way very few characters ever achieve. That version of Mega Man didn't need reinvention because it was never meant to grow, it was meant to persist. But persistence isn't the same thing as growth. As the audience aged and hardware evolved, classic Mega Man became a liability if left alone. It could survive, sure, but it couldn't absorb complexity without losing its identity. Capcom's solution wasn't to stretch past its limits, instead they just created a second lane. Mega Man X wasn't a sequel in spirit, it was a pressure valve. It allowed Capcom to introduce speed, momentum, upgrades, moral ambiguity, and failure states that would have felt out of place in the original framework. X didn't just play differently, it justified difference. It acknowledged that players were older now, more skilled, and more willing to accept that progress could come with loss. The key detail, though, is this. Capcom never replaced classic Mega Man with X. They let him coexist, really. And even when one clearly outpaced the other, culturally, and in any other way. That coexistence wasn't just generosity, though, it was insulation. When taste shifted again towards exploration, world building, and long-term engagement, Capcom didn't retrofit X to accommodate those demands at all. They built Legends, a version of Mega Man unrecognizable on purpose, slower, softer, more human. A character who existed in a space that asked players to linger rather than master. Legends wasn't designed to win the mainstream. It was designed to test whether Mega Man could survive without speed, without precision, without arcade lineage at all. The answer turned out to be complicated. But even in commercial uncertainty, Capcom didn't fold the experiment back into the mainline. They left it suspended, unfinished, unresolved, but not erased. But then came the most revealing shift of all. Battle Network wasn't just a genre change, it was a geographic one. A Mega Man built for a different cultural rhythm entirely. System-heavy, strategy-forward, structurally modular. It spoke the language of customization, collection, and long-tail engagement before those terms became industry defaults. It thrived in spaces where traditional console Mega Mans had stalled. Not because it was better or anything, but because it had been designed with a different audience at the center of its gravity. At this point, something critical had already happened, though. Capcom no longer had a Mega Man audience. They had multiple audiences that barely overlapped. And instead of consolidating them, Capcom kept the lanes isolated. Different tones, different mechanics, different release expectations, different definitions of success. To the public, this looks like experimentation. Internally, it functioned as risk distribution. No single Mega Man was ever allowed to carry the full weight of the brand again. This is where the illusion forms. Because from the outside, it looks like choice, it looks like preference. It looks like a fan base arguing in good faith about tone, difficulty, and identity. Classic versus X, X versus Legends, console versus handheld, action versus systems. The conversation feels organic, almost philosophical, as if the franchise itself is asking players to weigh in. But Capcom's behavior tells more of a consistent story than the discourse around it. Look at how these branches are treated when they stop performing. When classic Mega Man lost momentum in the late 90s, it wasn't retired, it was slowed. Releases became sparse, then careful, then nostalgic by design. When it returned in force decades later, it didn't chase modern design trends. It doubled down on what it already was. It wasn't a resurrection. This was preservation. Mega Man X followed a similar pattern. As the series struggled with diminishing returns, Capcom didn't fold its mechanics back into classic or discard its darker tone. Instead, the line quietly went dormant. No definitive ending, no public postmortem, just absence. And absence in a franchise this large is rarely accidental. It keeps the door open without committing resources. Legends was more telling, though, commercially uncertain, critically uneven, and left unfinished, yet never disavowed completely. No reboot, no reimagining, no attempt to fix it. Its unresolved state became part of its identity. Capcom didn't correct this experiment. They archived it intact. Battle Network, by contrast, was allowed to run its full course. Not because it was the real Mega Man, but because it worked where it was deployed. It peaked, concluded, and then was quietly celebrated as a closed system. When it returned years later, it returned whole, unchanged in philosophy, untouched by modern reinterpretation. It's not nostalgia anymore, that's respect for a branch that succeeded on its own terms. This pattern repeats too consistently to be a coincidence. Capcom doesn't collapse failed Mega Man ideas into new ones. They don't merge audiences, they don't declare successors. Instead, they pause, preserve, compartmentalize. Even the language surrounding the franchise reflects this. Marketing avoids hierarchy. Announcements emphasize fun rather than replacement. New projects are framed as additions, not corrections. At no point does Capcom publicly invalidate a version of Mega Man, because doing so would require admitting there was only ever room for one. I think that's the illusion here. The audience is encouraged to debate which Mega Man matters most, while Capcom behaves as if all of them matter differently. The debate feels like verdicts. The company's actions look more like indexing. And it isn't unique to Mega Man, but Mega Man exposes it more clearly than most franchises because of how far back the fragmentation goes. These branches weren't created in reaction to failure alone. They were introduced during moments when Capcom couldn't predict what gaming was about to become. Faster hardware, older players, portable dominance, networked play, long-form engagement. Rather than force Mega Man to mutate endlessly, Capcom allowed him to fork. So when one path slowed, another carried momentum. When one audience aged out, another one aged in. When one design philosophy hit its ceiling, another explored a different axis entirely. None of these moves required Capcom to admit the previous one was wrong. It's quiet brilliance. It's also quiet dishonesty of the system. The illusion is that the franchise itself is searching or looking into itself, trying to find itself, all that stuff. But the evidence suggests it already found what it needed. Redundancy. Multiple Mega Men mean no single failure is fatal. Multiple tones mean no single audience defines the brand. Multiple mechanics means no single era gets the final word. And from where I'm standing, that isn't confusion or cowardice. It's a company that stopped believing a single identity could survive everything it was about to face. And it built a structure that didn't need one to. I want to be clear about something before going any further. I was one of those people who believed Capcom didn't know what to do with Mega Man. Hell, the video was, I don't know, about a month and a half old, so I was just talking about this. And for a long time, that felt like the most reasonable conclusion. Long gaps between releases, entire sub-series left hanging, anniversaries that came and went without the fanfare you'd expect for a character this important. From the outside, it looked like uncertainty, like hesitation, like a company afraid to touch its own legacy for fear of breaking it. That was my read, and I stuck to it. But Dual Override forced me to slow down and re-examine that assumption. Not emotionally, not nostalgically, but structurally. When you strip away what felt like neglect and look instead at what Capcom actually did over time, the picture kind of changes in an uncomfortable way. It starts to look less like confusion and more like patience. Capcom's silence around Mega Man wasn't empty, it was selective. They never erased him, they never rebooted him out of desperation, and never shoved him into trends he couldn't survive. They let him recede without letting him collapse. That's not what companies do when they don't know what to do. That's what they do when they're waiting. Dual Override didn't arrive like a corrective action. It doesn't feel like Capcom scrambling to get Mega Man right again. It feels like Capcom's resuming a process that was always designed to be intermittent. It was a mainline classic sequel announced far ahead of release, shown with confidence but not over-explained, and positioned as part of a long lineage rather than a fresh start. If Capcom were uncertain, this game would be far louder. It would be safer. It would be framed as a revival or a rescue, and it isn't. What changed my perspective is recognizing how consistent Capcom has been in one specific behavior. They never collapse Mega Man's branches into each other. When something underperforms, it doesn't get rewritten, it gets paused. And when something succeeds, it allows them to finish on their own terms. When something divides the audience, Capcom doesn't force consensus. Once again, that's insulation. It's not indecision. I gotta be honest, for years I mistook that redundancy for lack of direction. Dual Override is where that interpretation kind of breaks down, because Dual Override doesn't try to reconcile the past. It doesn't unify timelines or bring every version into the same room or, have some sort of Avengers Endgame moment. It doesn't acknowledge the fracture as a problem at all. It doesn't need solving. It simply proceeds as if multiple interpretations are already valid and have always been. The game we know about reinforces that reading. It's a classic series continuation, not a reboot. It leans on familiar structures and familiar enemies, familiar rhythms. Proto Man's whistle isn't there to tease reinvention. It's there to remind you that unresolved threads are allowed to exist. The title itself doesn't promise novelty, it promises control. Override implies authority and Dual implies coexistence. From where I stand now anyway, that feels intentional. Anyway, recognizing a strategy doesn't automatically make it a good one though. This is the part I don't want to gloss over. Just because I can see now the long game doesn't mean the long game will pay off. Understanding Capcom's approach doesn't magically erase the risk involved in it. Patience can look like confidence, but it can also look like complacency if the timing's wrong. Dual Override could land perfectly. It could reaffirm that the classic framework still has weight, still has relevance, still has room to grow without reinventing itself. It could justify the years of restraint and prove that Mega Man doesn't need constant visibility to remain viable. Or it could expose the downside of waiting too long. A strategy built on preservation assumes the audience will still be there when you return. It assumes nostalgia hasn't cooled into indifference. It assumes the industry hasn't moved so far forward that familiarity becomes friction instead of comfort. Long games only work if the board doesn't change too much while you're playing them. Capcom is kind of betting that it hasn't. And that bet's real. Dual Override isn't just another entry, it's officially a stress test. Not of Mega Man as a character, but of the philosophy that's been protecting him. It will reveal whether patience preserved relevance, or merely delayed the moment of reckoning. From my perspective, that tension is what makes this moment most interesting, not necessarily triumphant. I'm not here to declare that Capcom was right all along, or that the plan is guaranteed to succeed. I'm here to acknowledge that I misread intent, and that the intent doesn't guarantee outcome. Capcom may have known what they were doing, but that does not mean it's going to work. And if Dual Override fails, it won't mean the strategy never existed. It'll mean the risk inherent in it finally came due. That's where we are right now. Not at the end of a long game, but at the point where it can no longer hide behind the silence. Okay, This is where the conversation stops being so abstract. Up till now, everything I've laid out can still be read as structural analysis, strategy, pattern recognition, corporate behavior viewed from a distance, so on and so on and so on. But none of that matters if it never intersects with the consequence. Long games are only impressive when they resolve into something meaningful. Otherwise, they're just extended delays dressed up as foresight. This is the part Capcom really can't control anymore. Because once you commit to patience as a strategy, you also commit to risk that compounds over time. Every year you wait raises the stakes. Every silence increases expectation. Every preserved idea becomes heavier the longer it remains untouched. A long game doesn't erase failure, it concentrates it. Dual Override carries all of that weight now. It isn't just another Megaman release. It's the first moment where Capcom's philosophy is forced into the open, whether they intended that or not. The game has to justify more than its own design. It has to justify the waiting. Not with words, but with results. The danger of fragmentation is not that audiences disagree, it's that they just drift away. Capcom's strategy only works if the branches remain emotionally connected to the core. If Classic still feels relevant, if X still feels foundational rather than forgotten, if Legends feels unfinished instead of abandoned, if Battle Network feels complete rather than isolated. Once those connections weaken, fragmentation stops being insulation and starts becoming erosion. Dual Override exists right on the fault line, right at the edge. On one hand, it reassures longtime fans that the classic framework is still alive, still valued, and still capable of carrying a full release. On the other hand, it risks reinforcing the idea that everything else is permanently sidelined. Not paused, not archived, just waiting without momentum. And that's the cost of not choosing. Because refusing to declare a definitive Mega Man doesn't mean the audience stops asking for one. It just means they ask louder and from farther apart. The longer the long game runs, the harder it is to satisfy anyone or everyone without feeling like you're ignoring someone. And Capcom knows this, which is why Dual Override feels so carefully positioned. Safe but not apologetic, familiar but not frozen. It's trying to thread a needle between reassurance and stagnation, between legacy and relevance, between patience and inertia. Whether it succeeds will depend on something that strategy alone can't solve, and that's resonance. If Dual Override feels alive, if it feels intentional rather than preserved, then the long game looks visionary. It proves that Mega Man didn't need constant reinvention to endure. It validates the idea that restraint can be just as powerful as risk. But if it feels hollow or overly cautious or disconnected from the present moment, then all that patience will retroactively look like avoidance. Not of the trends, but of the decisions. And that's the line. Capcom didn't bet on Mega Man being dominant. They bet on him being durable. Dual Override is where we find out if durability is enough. Because the industry doesn't reward survival alone, it rewards relevance. And relevance isn't something you can store on a shelf and pull down intact years later. It has to be renewed, even if the form stays the same. From where I'm sitting, that's the real tension at this point. Not whether Dual Override will be good, not whether it'll even sell, but whether it will feel necessary. A long game only works when the final move lands. It should feel like it shouldn't have happened any other way. If Dual Override achieves that, then Capcom's patience was justified, even admirable. If it doesn't, then no amount of foresight will soften the realization that waiting has consequences too. Either way, this is no longer theory. The long game has reached the part where it has to show its hand. And once it does, Mega Man won't just be defined by what Capcom planned, but by what the plan was willing to risk. I don't know if you guys have seen the gap between Mega Mans and just how much of a dry spell there was between different eras of Mega Man, but it's outrageous. And if this were any other franchise, it simply wouldn't work. The amount of patience needed to cultivate this kind of move is absurd on its head. But in the end, I do believe this will be by far the most interesting time Mega Man's had, wondering if he can resurrect himself from the ashes this far into the future. I don't know. We're going to have to see. And I will definitely have my finger on the pulse trying to figure out what's going on with it. In the meantime, I appreciate you guys for popping by and listening to me rant about possible gambits between company and their wonderful flagships. If you have any questions for me, if you have any comments, you agree, disagree, you know what to do. Go down in the comments, send me something. If you like what you see here, like and subscribe. It helps me do what I am doing. And at this point, it is trying to decipher the inner workings of companies that I have no official standing with. I do appreciate you guys for your time. Shout out to everybody on Patreon. And if anybody needs anything from me, you know where to find me. All social media is known to man. I'm there. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here. You guys have a good night.